Okay, good evening, everyone. Tonight, we're very lucky to have this lovely lady, Eleanor, who knows every pavement stone, lamppost, house, shop, and probably everybody that had ever lived in the East End. Eleanor is a retired police officer who served in the City of London force for 34 years. As well as uniform beat duties, she served in a variety of specialised operational posts. Since retiring in 2007, she qualified as a London tour guide and currently conducts guided walks, sharing her discoveries. Eleanor is particularly interested in social and cultural Jewish history. In 1881, the Jews of Eastern Europe started a mass migration. Many settled in the east of London, and by 1910, there are 150,000 Jews in the borough of Stepney. This talk will cover the arrival of the Ashkenazi Jews, looking at the port of landing, settlements, and a place of refuge in a small part of the East End, which the Jews made their home. They'll find out about philanthropists, social reformers, the origins of Jewish youth clubs, and visit the scene of the famous Battle of Cable Street. Eleanor will be talking, but only answering questions at the end. So please use the chat room or the remote hand, but don't crazily keep waving your hands because we may not miss you. So over to you, Eleanor.
Thank you, David. Good evening, everyone. My name is Eleanor. You've probably gathered that already. And I'm going to take you on an armchair walk, a walk of nostalgia through the streets of the East End of London. You may not all be familiar with the East End, but I'm sure there are plenty of folks here this evening whose ancestors, whose roots derive from the East End of London. David has said it all really, all the places we're going to visit, the people that we're going to see. We're going to cover the Jewish youth clubs and philanthropists, visit, as David said, the famous Battle of Cable Street, and we'll look at social reformers, and philanthropists, and all sorts of things really. Just to give you a bit of background, in 1881, there was a mass emigration from we won't call it the Soviet Union because that hadn't come about yet, but the Russian Empire. So that's not only Russia, but all the satellite countries about, all around it. And they were leaving in their droves. In fact, within about 30 to 50 years, 3 million Jews left the Russian Empire. It was very popular to go to what they knew as the Golden Medina, and that's America. Everyone wanted to go to America. They'd heard such stories, the type of thing, the streets probably paved with gold. That's, actually that's a London expression, but I'm sure that's how they felt. And opportunities for everyone. Now, not everyone could get the money to go as far as America. And the ones that couldn't raise enough money could only come as far as the United Kingdom. And then there were quite a lot that were tricked into thinking that they've bought tickets to go to America. And they were given tickets that didn't send them that far. They may have disembarked in Dublin or Belfast or Hull or Grimsby, Liverpool, London, anywhere there were docks, basically all around the British Isles. In the south of England, the majority of people entering came through the Port of London. And oh God, sorry about this. I can't seem to. Just bear with me a moment. There we go. They came through the Port of London, and they came on steamships from the northern ports, such as Brennan Danzig, Rotterdam, Odessa, places like that. And imagine if you're living in the interior of the Russian Empire, how long it would have taken you to get to one of those ports, and how would you have traveled? So by the time these people, and we're talking about our folks from 1881 for the next 50 years, how they managed to get to wherever they were leaving from, whichever port. And they would have traveled for days sometimes. And, we don't actually know how they did it. But these are the sort of ships that they would have sailed on. We've got the Columbia, Schwab, and there are various others. They usually didn't have first-class tickets. I can't imagine many of them had tickets to, with fine dining or anything like that. They were usually, these were cargo boats, so their sleeping quarters and their eating quarters were usually in the bow of the ship. It was very crowded conditions. Most people hadn't even been on a ship before, because they didn't live anywhere near a river or the sea, or they just didn't have opportunities. And in fact, there were no opportunities for Jews for many years. And the reason so many left after 1881 was because of the restrictions set on their lives. There was a decree by Nicholas II in the 1880s, and they came out in their droves. So it could have taken a couple of weeks to reach their destination. And the ones that came into the East End of London arrived at what we call today St. Catherine's Dock, but it was then called St. Catherine's Wharf. And it was purely industrial. It was, that they received commodities from all over the world, tea and fruit and all sorts of things, tobacco. And, when we say, very commonly, we say that our folks came in on the onion boats. I mean, they literally did. There was no luxuries for them. And so we've got these pictures of the sort of people they were. Now, you might say they were peasants because of the way they were dressed. They certainly didn't get the opportunity to be educated in the secular society because of the way Jews were, they were barred from going into universities, entering public life, entering any other professions and things like that. And so they may have been rich in culture, in their own culture, the Yiddish culture, because Yiddish was the common language, but it didn't mean that they were literate in Russian. And the sort of people here were so suppressed by the Russian, not just the Russian government, but the Russian Empire, that they had to live like peasants, even if they were very intelligent and whatever. So you see their bundles, even the babies looked like bundles of rags because they were all bundled up in, cloth. And the people looked very thin and undernourished. They actually looked really fed up. So when they landed at St. Catherine's Wharf, the English language wasn't familiar to their ears. And the officials that they had to deal with when they had to go and register really couldn't understand them. Some of them may have even learned Yiddish over the years just to be able to communicate with these folk. And it wasn't long before the Poor Jews Temporary Shelter was set up. It was in Lemon Street, if anyone's familiar with the East End. It was originally called the Poor Jews Temporary Shelter, but then the poor was dropped a while later. And they would send representatives to the dock or to the wharf to come and interpret for the new arrivals, for the new people. And when these new arrivals went through the registration and they gave their names, the surnames, because it was compulsory to have a Russian sounding or a Slavic sounding surname, the English authorities couldn't understand them, let alone spell their names, which is why we've got a lot of families even today with many variations of the same family name. You might get Shapiro, Spiro, you know, that's just an example. But another very common practice was for the officials to take the first name of the elder of the family. I mean, the families didn't all arrive together sometimes. They could often only pull their money together to get one person to come abroad and to, you know, find a job, find somewhere to live, and then send for their wives and their children or whatever. So, but the authorities would often take the first name, for example, Joseph or Jacob or Abraham, and they'd turn it into their surname, which is why in those days it was very common for wives to be called by their husbands' first names, like Mrs. Joseph or Mrs. Isaacs, Mrs. Solomon, when that was the first name of their husbands. That was very common. So, as I say, Yiddish was their cultural language, and it wasn't long before they were eager to cast off that sort of that image of their arrival as being peasants, and you know, they wanted to take on the English culture. In fact, they were highly encouraged, and I'll go on about that a bit later in the talk. They were highly encouraged to drop the Yiddish language, and you know, particularly the children of the immigrants. But I'll talk about that later. And so, you know, these representatives would go to the dock to meet these and get them through the officialdom, through the registration. And the other reason was to prevent the dockside pimps taking advantage of, you know, these poor, I say poor, they were definitely not wealthy, but poor, you know, because of their conditions and, you know, the way they came with nothing really, with their work on their back. When I mentioned dockside pimps, we associate the word pimp with prostitution. They did take young girls, a lot of young ladies arrived on their own. You know, they came in the hope of finding a better life, and perhaps because they were very skilled seamstresses, that they might get useful employment and, you know, just a bit of fun even, you know, to have adventure. So that was quite common. So yeah, these pimps did prey on those girls, and those girls were called kurovas. Unfortunately, they had a very bad image amongst their own people. You know, and when you've got nothing and you're promised the earth, you fall for it. You're taken in by all this sort of stuff. So that was the reason the representatives from the Poor Jews Temporary Shelter went to the docks, and they alighted, once they'd registered, they alighted by the Iron Gate steps. Now, I've no image of the steps at all. I've never been able to find a drawing or a picture of the Iron Gate steps. Stood where the north side entrance to Tower Bridge is today. Tower Bridge wasn't built until 1894, and you know, the immigrants were coming in from, well, en masse from 1881. Prior to that, it was 1870 really. You had a trickle from 1870, but certainly, you know, they came en masse. In 1910, there was a census of the East End, and there were 250,000 Jews in the borough of Stepney. Now, I think the population, the Jewish population of Great Britain at the moment is 250,000. So it just goes to show. And when we talk of the borough of Stepney, you have to realise that it's only 1/3 of the borough of Tower Hamlets today. Because when Tower Hamlets was formed in 1965, it incorporated 3 London boroughs: Bethnal Green, Stepney and Poplar. So Stepney is only 1/3. So you can imagine the conditions they lived in. They were so overcrowded, and well, disease, as you can imagine, was rife. Now we're going back to the temporary shelter here. They were only allowed to stay there for 14 nights. And if they were lucky, they were given a piece of paper with an address. They were recommended to go and lodge somewhere, or they may have been given the details of a workshop, somewhere to go to get employment, if they were lucky. Not everyone did. And they were given 2 meals a day. They were given porridge in the morning and soup and bread in the evening, nothing else. Now, when I talk about lodgings, this is quite a well-known picture. This is Dorset Street in Spitalfields. The Jews, well, they congregated, not all in this street, but, you know, around the wider area of Spitalfields, Aldgate, Whitechapel, which made up the borough of Stepney. Now, I've chosen this picture because it gives you an example of the overcrowding conditions inside the tenements, and how, you know, because they had big families and they could have lived 8 or 10 to 1 room. And if they were lucky enough to have a table, they'd bring in a lodger to sleep under the table. I mean, you know, that's sort of, that's common in stories that I've heard. Now, these women, as you see, congregating in the street, all the children played outside, obviously weather permitting, but just to get some fresh air. And I'm not sure how fresh the air was around Spitalfields then. I mean, it's not too bad now. I mean, we complain about the air pollution, but it was 100 times worse in the late 19th century, the turn of the 20th century, and even the early 20th century. The women were often pregnant most of the time. My own grandmother had 16 pregnancies and 12 children survived, and they all grew up, funnily enough. So, yeah, so it just gives you an example of the women, or, you know, or the families hanging around outside in the street. Such was the overcrowded conditions that the disease of typhoid, tuberculosis and cholera were rife. They were very, very common. Tuberculosis especially, typhus not so much, but it was there. But there was an organisation set up, and all these organisations that I'm going to show you, and we've already looked at the Poor Jews Temporary Shelter, and now we're looking at the Jewish Border Guardians, and in a while we'll be talking about the soup kitchens. They were all set up by the wealthy Sephardi Jews. Now, the wealthy Sephardi Jews, like, I don't know the names, Montagues, Makata, Rothschilds, etc., they were well established in this country because they came into this country after 1656, and they were the wealthy merchants and the bankers, and they were embarrassed when you had this sudden influx of, if you like, their country cousins who they bore no relation to. They viewed the Ashkenazi Jews, and when I say Ashkenazi, we're talking about from Eastern Europe, yeah, basically. The Sephardi Jews, they came from originally Spain and Portugal, even going right back to the 15th century before the Inquisition. And since then, they gravitated around the world. They gravitated to places like Iraq and Iran and India and whatever. So, and even Holland. So they were the Sephardi Jews. So that they came in a long time before the Ashkenazis. And they were really embarrassed by these foreigners, if you like. They couldn't believe, you know, they were Jews, okay, but completely different culture, different language, because the Sephardi Jews traditionally they spoke a form of Portuguese which was called Ladino, and you know, they really established themselves well before these peasants, because they called them peasants. They really did. They had smelly food and, you know, bad habits because of their overcrowded conditions. So there was an organization set up called the Jewish Border Guardians. They basically oversaw the living conditions, the social conditions, and the behavior, if you like. I know it sounds awful, but they did. They oversaw the behavior of the Ashkenazi Jews. They weren't very impressed with it. And it was all funded by, you know, by welfare, by public funds. People made donations to help the Ashkenazi Jews. They even set up a sanitary board, sanitary inspectors to go around the lodging houses. There were common lodging houses even where just single men slept in one room, in dormitories, not in a separate room. And they inspected people, not only their homes, but the workshops that they worked in and their living conditions. And as a result of that, they were able to eliminate the tuberculosis, the amount of tuberculosis that was going around. Not eliminate it entirely, because it was really the vaccines of the 1950s, you know, after the National Health Service was set up in 1948. But still, they did alleviate a lot of it. Now, these Jews were known as greenhorns. I don't know if you've ever heard that expression, greeners or greenhorns. That meant that they were totally alien to the British way of life. However, having said that, we had, and I can't give you every example, but there were so many, and there are so many influential Jews that derive from the East End today. I'm just giving you two examples here. On your left, you've got Lionel Begleiter, and you recognize him, I hope. He said, "Things ain't what they used to be." He was most notable for writing musicals, being a playwright. He became known as Lionel Bart. And the house below his picture is where he was born and grew up, and that was in Princelet Street in Spitalfields. Now, they didn't occupy the entire house. It was very rare that a family would occupy the entire house. They may have had 2 rooms, even 1 room. And he had, I can't remember exactly, but about 9 siblings, something like that. Come from very humble origins. And on the right, you get Chaim Reuven Weintraub, and that's Bud Flanagan, as we knew him. So you recognize Bud Flanagan. He's not wearing his fur coat here. Do you remember he used to sing "Underneath the Arches"? He was known for his place in the Crazy Gang. And he was born above this cafe. I won't call it a cafe because I don't think it was as posh as a cafe. It was a cafe, Rosa's Cafe. I don't think it was called Rosa's Cafe when he was born there. And he was born in the 2 rooms on the first floor. His entire family lived up there. That's quite a popular place today. It's known as Poppy's Fish and Chips, and that's in Hanbury Street in Spitalfields. Everyone claims to be the best this and the best that. They claim to have the best fish and chips in London. I can't vouch for that at all. But I'm only giving those as an example. There were so many influential people that came out of the East End. They were born to immigrant parents. They were immigrants themselves. The Grade family. So that's Lou Grade. He was actually born in Russia. He didn't come here till he was, I think, about 12, something like that. Their family name was Winogradsky, and he had other siblings that also became, what would you call them in the theatrical world? Not entrepreneurs, impresarios. Impresarios is the word I'm looking for. So his brothers were Leslie Grade and who became, another brother was became Bernard Delfont. Yeah. So and his nephew, of course. I'm talking about Lou Grade's nephew, Michael Grade. He's still with us today, and he's still very influential in TV. I'm just giving you an example. And another organisation that was set up by these wealthy Sephardi Jews was the soup kitchen. There was never just the one soup kitchen, but the reason I'm showing this is because it was probably the largest, and the building is still there today. It's in Brune Street in the East End, if you're familiar with it. And you can see the inscription. You've got a way in on the right and a way out on the left. And it says it was established in 1902. Well, it was actually established in the 1880s, and this building was erected specifically for this purpose in 1902. They served about 3,000 meals a week, and you'd have to be registered. And not every person that was registered could actually walk to the soup kitchen, so they would get the children, the grandchildren to go for them, with their billy can and the billy can for the soup, and they would have to take some container or other for other food to be put in. They gave out not just soup, but other things. They always gave out bread. On Yom Tov, they gave out, for Shavuos, they gave out cheesecake and matzahs for Pesach, etc., and challah on Shabbos. So, yeah. This only closed in the early 1980s. And then we didn't know soup kitchens until a few years ago. Unfortunately, I'm not talking about Jewish soup kitchens today, but, just generally we hear about them. And I'm sure there are organisations that provide kosher food too. Stepney Green dwellings, if anyone lived there, it's just an example of, again, the wealthy Sephardi Jews protecting and looking after the Ashkenazis. They had foresight. They knew that to get them out of the slums, they were living in dire conditions in the slums, they would have to provide housing, and they provided lots of housing. They called them dwellings because that was a Victorian term. It's not very fashionable today. In fact, Stepney Green dwellings still exist, but they've dropped the dwellings bit and they call it court, Stepney Green Court today. This is actually in the street called Stepney Green. So you can see very typically how these mansions look. And by the way, if you ever heard someone say, the Lord will provide, they weren't talking about the Almighty, they were talking about the Rothschilds, the Lord Rothschild. And the dwellings were built in the 1880s, and they were all provided, they were built to provide fresh air. So where you've got the staircases going up, you see my arrow, going up the landing, yeah, and the first floor, and it goes up and up. It's about 4 floors. All the landings are open to the elements, and that was designed to bring in the fresh air so that they weren't all enclosed. And in the 1880s, you could rent 1 room for 2 and 6p, and you can rent 2 rooms for 4 and 6p. And there was shared scullery on the landing and shared toilet on the landing. And the toilets, I mean, this is very typical of the type of dwelling, but there were others. There was Navarina mansions in Hackney, there was Brady Street dwellings. The Rothschilds building, most famously in Thrall Street, if you're familiar with Spitalfields at all. And, none of the others exist anymore. The Rothschilds buildings certainly don't exist. Navarina Mansions is still there. And so you can see again, you know, all the open landings, and these, it's got a very posh name, Navarino Mansions. They were all open to the elements. They were all built in a very similar fashion, and with the arch at the end there. Now, if you were lucky enough, and I say lucky because you had to put your name down and you had to fit the criteria, and there were massive waiting lists. People waited for years before they actually, before they were allocated a flat. But there were so many conditions. Now, what we think is Hebrew writing on the right is actually Yiddish, because Yiddish is very much a spoken language. It doesn't have its own written text. They use the Hebrew text. So they use the Hebrew letters to write phonetically with Yiddish. So I can't read it because I don't speak Yiddish. Some people might, but it's definitely not Hebrew. And you can see on the left, the translation, the 4% industrial dwellings company. So the Rothschilds buildings were known as the 4%, well, that was the organization. It was known as the Industrial Dwellings Company. It still exists today, and it's called the Industrial Dwellings Society. And they own a lot of properties that you may not realize, you know, Jewish properties. But what we've got here is any tenant taking a lodger will receive immediate notice to quit by order. That's 1902. They also provided wash houses because cleanliness and hygiene was so important. It was important not only to keep diseases away, but also for the self-esteem and the dignity of the individuals. And the Rothschilds found this to be very, very important. So did the Jewish Board of Guardians. So they very commonly providing bathhouses and wash houses on their estates. And on the left, you can see that the men and women have separate days. Yeah, the baths are open on weekdays from from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. and women and children on Monday, Thursday, and Friday, and men Tuesday, Wednesday, and Saturday. Now, I'm sure the bathhouses were not open on Saturdays during Shabbat. They probably opened afterwards, I imagine. But unfortunately, the men never got to use the baths on Fridays. So it was very common for the men to go to what they called the schwitz. And the schwitz was the steam baths. And all over the East End, there were these Turkish baths, Russian baths, well, they were called Russian steam baths. So the men would go there on Fridays. So look at this important notice on the right. Tenants are requested to keep their rooms exceptionally clean, as well as the landings and staircases. And that was the case in council properties as well, in secular housing, that everyone had a job to do. Everyone was responsible to keep the landings clean, keep their doorsteps clean, things like that, the staircases. Leading thereto as the health of all the residents in the buildings is endangered by uncleanliness. So look at the requirements. Windows are open daily, special attention to WCs and sinks. Disinfectants can be had free of charge on application to the superintendent. Now, where it says nothing but dry ashes or dust should be thrown down the dust chute. Well, in those days, they had open fires and coal just goes to dust. And often there were embers still alight. So if the dust was thrown down the chute before the embers had died, then there was big trouble. They caused fires. So that's the reason for that. Then they've got refuse of fish and vegetables, decaying matter. The children are not allowed to play on the stairs or balconies or the playground after 9 p.m. I don't know what tip cat is. It's obviously some form of ball game that the children played in those days. The rules will be strictly enforced and immediate notice to quit. How about that? Now, what sort of work did the Jewish community do? They had to make their livings. Now, traditionally, they brought their skills. They were skilled tradesmen, and they brought their skills on their backs. Here we have a picture of a market. Some people that didn't have skills, they went into the markets and they sold all sorts of produce. They bartered all sorts of things. So very commonly, we've got Golson Street here on Sunday morning. Golson Street is part of Petticoat Lane, but there were other very popular markets like Hessel Street, for example, and Ridley Road, and there were various others. They went into businesses like gentlemen's hairdressing. That was very popular. So it was right up until probably the 1960s even. The gentlemen hairdressers or barbers were mainly Jewish. After that, the Cypriots took over and the Turkish people. But yeah, gentlemen's hairdressing was done by the Jewish community. And this lovely picture on the right, Mr. Minsky, he's had a trimming shop. If you go down Brick Lane today, every unit is a curry house. But at one time, prior to right up until the mid to late 1970s, all the shops along Brick Lane were trimming shops, wholesale haberdashers, and somewhere you could buy string and paper bags and things like that. When I say they carried their skills on their back, they were very involved in the garment industry, in making hats and gloves. But another profession that was quite common amongst the Jewish settlers was woodworking. They were cabinet makers, and they actually made upmarket furniture, not just like a carpenter or anything. And the area around Hackney Road, if you're familiar with it, and Shoreditch, was the centre of the cabinet making industry. But here we've got garment workshops, and I expect they've all put on their shoppers' clothes to come and have their photograph taken. I don't think they saw photographers very often. And if someone was coming to take their photograph, they've all dressed up very nicely. And they all look quite happy too. But life wasn't always so happy in the workshops. They had the most awful conditions. There were trade unions that set up because of the conditions. set by their own people, you know, the governors of the workshops, the people that could afford, or they were successful enough to have their own businesses and employ others. The first Jewish trade union, there were lots of Jewish trade unions, and they were linked with communism and anarchism. It probably sounds a bit unsavory in current society, but the Jewish community in the East End at the turn, around about the turn of the 20th century, were very much steeped in communism. And because they felt it was their way out of the gutter. It was their way to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And can you see this red banner? That's the London Jewish Bakers Union. They were the first one to be set up in actual fact, but there were lots after them. There, you know, there was the Garment Union and all sorts of things. This is, as I say, Hebrew writing, Hebrew text, but with Yiddish phonetics. And this, I can actually read this. It says anarchist, Yiddishkeit. Oh, anarchists of Yiddishkeit, or something like that. So they organized strikes. There were lots of strikes in all the industries. There was a lot of unrest, you know, anarchist unrest, if you like. But there was also a lot of what we call today do-gooders. It's not a nice term, I suppose, but these were social reformers. I'm only giving you two examples here, and these are two people that you may be familiar with. On the right is Sir Basil Henricus, and you have to be pretty influential to have a street named after you, because there's a street in the East End called Henricus Street. It was originally called Berners Street, but Sir Basil Henricus was a JP, a Justice of the Peace, which is a local magistrate. He founded the Oxford and St George's Boys Club. He also founded a Reform synagogue. Well, they didn't use the term reform at that time. It was in 1914. He set up a liberal, if you like. He called it a liberal synagogue, which really went against the ethos of the general community in the East End. But he was very popular because he offered incentives for people to join the synagogue. And particularly when he set up the youth club, the original youth club was in Cannon Street Road, if anyone knows Cannon Street Road. That's off between Cable Street and Commercial Street. And then it moved in the 1930s to Berners Street, which is why it subsequently got called Henricus Street. And he offered not just the youth club, it was a communal centre where people could go and have baths. They could go and see a poor man's lawyer. They could get free boots, all sorts of things like that. On the left, we've got Miriam Moses. Now, Miriam Moses was also a Justice of the Peace, and they would often sit on the same bench in the magistrates' court, and they never got on. They saw themselves as rivals, really. So Miriam Moses, you can see she was on This Is Your Life. And this was in the 1950s. But she set up the Brady Girls Club, and they all had foresight, really, and she knew the way to a better future. And likewise with Basil Henricus, to get the children of the immigrants to integrate into society, to be successful English ladies and gentlemen, they would have to adopt English ways. It was largely as a result of people like this that we lost the Yiddish language. They encouraged English to be spoken. they wouldn't allow Yiddish to be spoken in the youth clubs. There were many other youth clubs. I'm just giving this as an example. In actual fact, Lady Miriam Moses, as you can see from the blue plaque, she was the first woman, not only the first woman mayor of Stepney, she was the first Jewish mayor of Stepney. So quite an accolade, really. And you can see her blue plaque again in Princelet Street, next door to this synagogue. Now, Princelet Street Synagogue, the building is still there, but it ceased to be a synagogue around about 1964. And it was just an empty shell because the building became unsafe. It's still not open to the public. They do open it to the public on specific days, but they can only allow so many in at a time because of health and safety regulations. There was plans to turn this building into the Museum of Immigration. Oh, there was a big fanfare a few years ago about this, and they held exhibitions there, but very soon after it was condemned again, and there's still no further on. So you can see visitors here, but usually open house weekend, which is usually the third weekend in September, where they allow people in to go and visit. Open house weekend often coincides with the High Holy Days, the Yom Tov. So, you know, it's not really fair to the Jewish community, who also want to see inside buildings that are usually inaccessible to the public. Now, the Yiddish Theatre was very popular. It was so popular right up until World War II. There were many Yiddish theatres around the East End, particularly around the borough of Stepney, and they stretched up to Hackney too. I've just given you two examples. You've got the Grand Palais on the left, which was in Commercial Road, and the Pavilion Theatre. Now, the Pavilion, which we see on the right, was in the Whitechapel Road on the corner of Valence Road, if you're familiar. That was bombed during World War II, and it just became a bomb site after that. But prior to the war, people flocked to see their favourite plays translated into Yiddish. On the left, you can see a poster, Anna Zelnicker. She used to play alongside her father, who was Maya Zelnicker. They came from Romania. She was 12 when she came to this country. But they used to translate Shakespeare into Yiddish and perform Shakespeare. It was very common. Unfortunately, you know, when the Yiddish language died out, so did the popularity of the Yiddish theatre. And certainly they were never revived after the war. Now we come to the very famous Battle of Cable Street, which occurred on the 4th of October 1936. It was a march that was planned. In fact, it was planned 3 months before by Sir Oswald Mosley, he was the leader of the British Union of Fascists, or Fascists, as they used to call it. Today, it tends to be called fascism, but they called it fascists or fascism then. Now, I think, and I don't know for sure, but I think if you look at the boys and girls and the people hanging out the windows on the first floor and the top floor, one of them could be my father, because he was due to have his bar mitzvah that weekend. It never took place. He never did have his bar mitzvah. And of course, he'd reached the age of 13. He wasn't allowed down by his parents, but his older siblings went down to fight. So he could be one of these boys hanging out the window. Yeah. So Oswald Mosley rallied 3,000 people to march with him through the East End of London as a deliberate provocation against the Jewish community. And they had us, you have to have a set route, and it's prescribed by the police. You have to notify the police. It was always the law. Give them notice, and they give you a prescribed route. Which now there was a lot of opposition by the Jewish community for this march to take place. Funnily enough, the Jewish Chronicle, in their editorial columns, said that they stated that they thought that the march should take place so that the Jews can hold their heads up high and show how dignified they are, and that they wouldn't be affected by this. But of course, the young Jewish community leaning towards communism and anarchism weren't going to have that. They rallied so much support. They rallied the support of the Welsh miners that sent coach loads down on that day from South Wales. They rallied support from the Irish dockers, who they never got on with. The Irish dockers were always very, dare I say it, they were anti-Semitic. They didn't like the Jews. And a lot of rivalry between the two factions, but they came out in solidarity on that day. Now, the original plans for the march was to march, if you're familiar with the East End, of course, they would have been going through Aldgate and down past Gardener's Corner, down Commercial Road. But the anarchists overturned a tram, so they couldn't get through. And the police diverted the march. Now, 3,000 marchers, but there were 30,000 Jews, miners, dockers, and who knows who else, 30,000 people trying to block that march. The police prescribed them to go instead, because of the overturned tram. They were taken through Lemon Street and down Cable Street. And Cable Street was and still is a very narrow turning. It's sort of fairly long. It stretches from Tower Hill, part of Tower Hill, right down to Limehouse. So it's quite a long street. But the 30,000 the counter protesters set up barricades. They were putting anything they could. They were throwing furniture out the windows. They set up barricades, as you see, with ladders, old prams, all sorts of things. And they were also encouraging the children to come out to make as much noise and as much disruption as possible to keep the marchers back. Now, during this period, there was the Spanish Civil War going on, and the Jews commonly in the East End came out in solidarity with the anti-fascists of the Franco's era, you know, of the Spanish Civil War. And lots of Jewish men, boys, went over to fight. But they also, as I say, they encouraged the children to make as much noise and much disruption. So the children came out with saucepans and frying pans and rolling pins, and they were banging, like, you know, banging drums and whatever. And the common shout was, as a result of the Spanish Civil War and the influence that they had from there, they were shouting, "Non pasarán," they shall not pass. And this went on and on. There were lots of casualties, lots of injuries. The police were injured. The police came through on horseback because they were trying to clear a path for the marchers to get through. There was a lot of disruption where the horses, I won't go into detail because it doesn't make for very pleasant listening, you know, with marbles being thrown under the horses' feet and things like that, and the horses went down, and lots of people were injured. But actually, the marchers, Mosley's fascists, were defeated because they didn't get through. Non pasarán, they shall not pass, and they didn't pass, they didn't get through. So that's the famous Battle of Cable Street. Right, now I've come to the end of my PowerPoint. This has taken me an hour, and you wouldn't believe it, but I've just got so much more material that I could use. But, you know, there's only limited time. I could bore you silly with all this. There's just one picture that didn't show up. I don't know what happened to it. Oh, here it is. Yeah, I just want to show you this. Can you see this picture? Yeah, it's just a collage of different names of the of places in the East End that you might recognise. I'm sorry, but I can't get my big picture up again because I can't see where it says. Oh, okay, here we go. You got a minute for this?
Yes, yes.
Just a second for this. Sorry, I'm just going to go through again. Try and. Sorry, I don't know why this happened. I can't get it now.
If you get to the bottom left of the, it should pop up.
No, it's not moving now.
Is it not?
Oh, very sorry about that. I wanted to show you some of the familiar names. So, you know, you would have had Brady Street and Lemon Street, Cable Street, all sort of places that you would recognise. I can't even escape from this now for some reason. Let's see if I can move this upwards. No, I'm terribly sorry. I can't do it now. It's just not working. It took me through the PowerPoint and now I can't get out of it. Sorry about that. Okay, so I just wanted to give you some example of the street names. We mentioned all sorts of names there that you might be familiar with. We mentioned Brick Lane and Brune Street, Spitalfields, you know, all sorts of places like that, Stepney Green. And, you know, there were lots of books written. I've never written a book, but there's you know, a lot of reading to do if you wanted to find out more about the Jews in the East End. I've gone through a potted history, but the one thing that is so surprising, I suppose, is how we did survive. It didn't actually take communism to drag us out the gutter. Ironically, we dragged ourselves out of the gutter probably through capitalism, you know, making good in society, becoming recognizable and respected members of society. And here we are, and now in the 21st century, we've seen an upsurge of anti-Semitism lately, but generally, we have established ourselves as London Jews. And all I can say is that our folks couldn't wait to move out of the East End. But let me tell you, you couldn't afford to move back to the East End now.
That's true.
It really is very, very trendy and very expensive. It's still a dump. There's lots of new developments, but it's still... I think the majority of people wouldn't find it desirable, but it's very trendy and it's a really popular place to live in now. So expensive. So anyway, I've come to the end of my talk, and I'm happy to take any questions. You know, let's go to the floor.
Okay. Well, I was actually thank you very much for that. It was. I wish you could have gone on for another couple of hours.
Yeah.
You know, when you spoke about names and the shawls, and because the shawls now, most of them are mosques, which I find it.
Well, yes.
But you know, but that was it. But anyway, so what I was going to say, we've got this chat now. The chat is supposed to be for people to put questions in there. But most of them have just put statements in, which are a bit slightly, I don't know, but Just give me a couple of minutes while I read
Can
them
you
out.
just give me a moment? I didn't realise how dark my background was
Of
because I
course.
couldn't see myself, and I can just see myself, and it's very dark in here. I'm
It's
just going
okay.
to put the lights on.
Yeah.
If you want to stop sharing when you come back, and then we can see your picture will fill the screen.
Only be a second.
I think, David, most of the comments, I was looking at them as they came through, that they're comments on the talk rather than questions.
Well, that's
Oh,
right. But I think
okay.
what I'll do, let me just.
Could you read the chats?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just going to go through it quickly, and hopefully some of these people may turn it into questions. So let me just run through it very quickly.
Flora's.
So we've got a question from Flora as well.
Yeah.
I'll do Flora first, and then we can go to the chat.
All right, okay.
Hi, Flora, your line's unmuted.
Thank you. Oh, that was an amazing talk. Thank you very, very much. Can I ask you a question? Why did Sir Basil Henriques call the Oxford and St. George's Club? From where did he get that name? I always wondered. It was so very English. I know he was very English, but from where did he get that name?
He was very English. And that's a very good question. I'm glad someone raised that question. He was very English. He came from a Sephardi background, but he felt it was his, I won't say duty, but it was his calling to live and work amongst the poor Jews of the East End. And he was very influential. He came from, as I said, he came from a wealthy Sephardi family, and he was actually educated at Oxford University, which was so rare at the turn of the 20th century for a Jewish boy to get a degree at one of the Oxford colleges. He was very proud of that, naturally. So he used Oxford as part of the name for this. It was a settlement. He called it a settlement. And St. George's is the name of the parish. How ironic, eh? That they used the name of the local church, the local Christian parish, which was and still is St. George's. And that's how the club and the synagogue became known as Oxford and St. George's. But it was more commonly known as the settlement.
Okay, thank you.
Now,
And Miriam Moses, may I ask you, Miriam Moses, I have a sister. My surname was Moses. I have a sister called Miriam Moses. So I was always very interested in this lady. I mean, she was well before my time. But where did she come from? Was she Sephardi?
No, she came from, as far as I know, she came from Ashkenazi stock. I might be wrong. But she was actually born here. And she was born in that house in Princelet Street, where we saw the blue plaque.
Thank you.
Yeah, and she was, I said before, she had such foresight. She set up elocution classes for the girls at the Brady Club, and embroidery, and deportment, and she wanted to show them the finer things in life, so that they didn't always have to behave as their immigrant parents behaved, and that was the ethos of the club. And then they're talking about Oxford and St. George's. Now, the origin of the name Brady is because the original club, it was set up for boys originally, and that was in Brady Street.
Right.
And then when she set up the girls' club, it was in Hanbury Street, but she didn't call it the Hanbury Club. It was still the Brady Girls' Club. I was a Brady girl, by the way.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It was fascinating.
Alex has got his.
Yeah, I'll unmute Alex.
Now, I must say that Alex has got quite a few statements in the chat room, so that I don't need to read all of those out now. So I'm not sure who you are, Alex, but please carry on and use the statements that I was going to read out to you.
Okay, I'm Alex Klein. I'm from Manchester. I'm Spencer is a friend, and we do all the Chazonus bits and pieces. I'm the director of the European Cantors Association, etc., and very friendly with Edgware. And I used to live in Golders Green. My dad was from the East End, grandfather, great grandmother, etc., So I used to go on a regular basis when I was a child. Loved it. Prince Honolulu. I got a horse. etc. But what I wanted to mention, people, you didn't mention it, but the more well-to-do Jewish people around the time owned pubs, because that was because of the problems of anti-Semitism and getting work and education. They had to go into a profession where they could make money. What actually happened, you've heard the expression order, and people think that comes from the courts or the legal profession, but it doesn't. It actually comes from the pubs, where the Jewish acts that came into the pub. So the landlord would bang on the desk on the bar and say,
it was an encouragement, it was an incentive.
People to order the drink before the guy could or the girl could come on. And we had the Yiddish Theatre here in the East End, the original under Adler, when Adler was the chief rabbi. Right. Before it went to
it was in Adler Street, actually.
Yeah, before it went to America. So they came over from Poland with their troupe, and they were chucked out by the chief rabbi, who had nothing to do with them, because he didn't want them to speak English. He wanted to anglicize everything, as you mentioned before. And then they went out, and then they went to Paris, and they got rid of them there, and they ended up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. You know, the big Yiddish theatres and the greatest artists in the world performed there. We lost out again. So the unfortunate thing. But you have brought back so many fabulous memories, and if I was with you, I'd give you a huge hug, because it's
well, we'd have to rub elbows, wouldn't we?
Rub elbows, yeah. But it's reminiscing, and I can take myself walking through these and the families and things like that. But I found out information from news cuttings and relatives I didn't even know I had. So because of the East End, and running from the pogroms and doing things like that. But the synagogue life, and nearly every street corner had a synagogue. There's still some open today.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because there's always things I forget to say. And when I was showing you the image or the picture of Princelet Street Synagogue, what I had forgotten to tell you was that was a backyard synagogue, and there were many. They were called stiebels. A stiebel is just a Yiddishism for
my great grandmother had one.
Maybe in a room, someone had a room to spare, but in many cases the backyards were covered over and they were used as shawls.
Haley Street and Nelson Street, Philpott Street, Cables. They all had their own Princelet Street, Little Princelet Street. They all had their own.
A lot of the shawls were also the purpose-built places of worship, I should say, rather than just utilising a room or backyard or something. They were taken over from Huguenot Chapels.
Yeah, that's right.
The Huguenots were French Protestants that came to this country as refugees because they were oppressed by the Catholics, and that was in the 18th century. So that was a whole century and more before the Ashkenazi Jews.
Well, you can
see the Huguenots they assimilated eventually, and where they assimilated and their temples, their chapels weren't required, the Jews took over the buildings, and now it's turned. I won't say it's turned a full cycle, but now all the purpose-built buildings, synagogue buildings in the East End are now mosques. I say not all.
I would like to make a suggestion that instead of having the Holocaust Memorial by the Thames, they should take one of the derelict synagogues and make it and resurrect it and make it into a memorial where it serves a purpose a heck of a lot better than letting it die.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. It really is. I never thought of it myself, but now you mention it, there's Nelson Street, which is derelict. It's empty, and it's never going to be reopened because they can't afford to do it. Anyway, going back to what you were saying very quickly about the Jewish pub landlords, that was very common because in the Russian Empire, I won't say all, but a lot of the bars were owned by Jews. Now, whether the secular Russians were allowed to go in there or not in them or not, I mean, I really don't know. But when they came to England, they took over licensed premises. And around the East End, there were many, many licensed premises that were run by Jewish families. And ironically, they didn't produce drinkers, if you know what I mean. We
But
were
that's
never,
how
we
that's
were
how they
never a
got.
drinking culture, were we? So,
You know, when you sell your chometz on Pesach, the reason why you sell it is because of the pubs and the landlords. They couldn't stop working over Pesach, so they had to sell, which is the drink, which is completely chometz. So by selling it, that's how we got the selling of the chometz, because of the pub owners.
I never thought of that.
But that was basically the reason how it came about as a. It's not a modern thing. It goes way back.
Yeah.
There's so many different things, anomalies and different things that people don't realise there's a good reason behind these things.
Yeah.
I mean, you haven't mentioned Duke's Place. There's another one. The great synagogue,
Duke's Place is not, the great synagogue. Yeah, of course, that was an Ashkenazi synagogue. That was bombed during the war. Can I just move on? I don't mean to be rude, Alex.
Sorry, no, I apologise.
I'd like to speak to Sylvia, please.
Yeah, well, thank you, Alex. We'll unmute Sylvia. There we go. Sylvia, your line's open, and then we'll go to Shlomo.
I put it on the chat, but when I first left home when I was 19...
Can't hear you, Sylvia, I'm sorry.
Can you get closer to the microphone, Sylvia?
Can you hear me now?
No.
Very faintly.
Talk loudly.
Turn my sound up. It's up high anyhow.
No, if you put your sound up, that's just the incoming sound. That's not your speech.
All right, can you hear me?
Yeah, very faintly, so please go ahead.
When I first left home, I live in the northeast of England.
Yeah.
My mother came from Stepney Green. My grandfather, whose name was Reverend Signaevsky, and he was the chazan at Rectory Square Shul. Ooh,
Really?
Terrible. And I went to work at the Stepney Jewish Settlement in Beaumont Street.
Yeah, Beaumont Square, yeah.
Beaumont Square, yes. Yeah. Well, it was Beaumont Street, the settlement.
I think, yeah, okay. Yeah.
And I actually went to a wedding in my grandfather's former shul. He died long before, but it was wonderful to see inside it.
Oh, you know, it was a beautiful place. The Rectory Square Synagogue in Stepney Green was the most beautiful building. It was designed very much in the Moorish style, you know, southern Spain or North Africa. But I don't know why, because that's a Sephardi style rather than Ashkenazi. Although it was Ashkenazi because it was. But when you say that, it's interesting to hear that your grandfather was a chazan, because there was a choir at that particular synagogue, and they wanted to allow women to sing in the choir, and there was such a hoo-ha, such a hue and cry, because you know, in Orthodoxy you can't listen to women's voices, so that the faction that wanted to have women's voices in the choir moved away, and they set up their own synagogue a few doors away. So I wonder which side your grandfather was on, whether he was pro-women or anti-women in the choir.
I've got no idea. I've actually got a recording of him, and he died in 1932.
Wow.
Yes.
That's nice. Can I move on? Sorry, I don't mean to be rude, Sylvia. Can I move to Shlomo, please?
We've got two things of Sylvia.
Yeah, that was why we were getting the feedback, but it should be fine now.
Right.
Shlomo Kramen, your line should be unmuted.
Shlomo, unmute yourself.
I can.
There we go. Oh,
No, neither.
I'll try again.
Yeah, I think we're on. Right.
Go on, we can hear you.
Yes, first of all, a correction, I'm afraid, and that regards Nelson Street. Nelson Street is not closed because it can't afford to be open.
No, it's condemned, isn't it?
A couple of years ago, most of the roof collapsed, and the Federation has refused to pay to have the place repaired.
I beg your pardon. Okay,
that's right.
Perhaps I shouldn't have said
the rabbi
that.
there is a friend of mine, and that's how I know. But I've been in there many times. And finally, a very quick story for you. As it's the Queen Mother's birthday, but she was introduced to the Grade's mother, and she said Mrs. Grade, she said, you must be so proud of your children. And the old lady turned to the Queen Mother and said, so your Majesty must be you of yours.
I wonder. Yeah, I wonder. Did I mention their name? Their family name was Winogradsky.
Yes.
And of course, they anglicised it, as did a lot of people anglicised their name.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Choma. Yeah. Any other hands up?
Can I just say something?
Yeah.
Time's getting on a bit. I won't go into the chat anymore because that sort of disappeared now. But I go to the East End, not a lot, but a reasonable amount, and it, it's changed so much. But and I suppose it's probably going to be very racist what I'll say, but my parents got married in a shul called Filgate Street. Yeah, and
sorry, I missed that. Your parents got married where?
In Filgate Street.
Okay.
That was in 1940 or 1939, 1940, something like that. And I went there some years ago, and there was a mosque next door to it, and Filgate Street was still open. And apparently the mosque and the people that were left in Filgate Street, although they used to get millions and so on, and apparently they were very, very friendly.
Yeah, they are. They're very friendly. In fact, the mosque coveted that building for many years.
Yes.
So until eventually they did close down, they were able to take it over. But I have heard that they're very friendly.
But this is. But when I went to see it, I think the mosque is now taking it over, as they've done with most of shuls. There's only about 2 or 3 shuls left in and it's really it's heartbreaking to go there and to see what were shuls are now mosques, which is a terrible thing to say, no, but life carries on, isn't it?
We're victims of our own success, and that's why.
Well, I suppose so, yeah.
We look back with nostalgia, but at the time, nobody wanted to be in the East End. Everyone aspired to better things, and like I said, our folks couldn't wait to get out.
Okay, was that Flora flashing?
It was Flora, but it was a statement rather than a question. But it's a nice. Her son basically did her birthday is today, so shares it with the late Queen Mum.
Oh, okay.
It's nice.
Flora said, okay.
Yeah. So no more questions at the moment, David.
No, okay. Well, in which case, can I sort of close it down now? I didn't get a chance to say many questions, but anyway, another time, please God. Ellen, that was great. Although I personally never lived in the East End, but my parents and grandparents did, and they were really always talking about it. Is somebody else saying? Oh, okay. Hold on, Flora's hand's gone up again. Is that intentional, Flora? No. Anyway, and my parents always used to talk about Yiddish and all spoken Yiddish. So we picked up bits and pieces, but it was only our grandparents that spoke proper Yiddish. My parents spoke it, as most parents did, but usually so that the children, me, couldn't understand what they were saying, which is, I'm sure a lot of people like that. So this was a real walk down memory lane. It was really something. So do you want to say something, Flora? You've got to mute yourself.
Hold on, let me unmute Flora. There you go, Flora.
No, I just think it was so lovely the way Eleanor said that we couldn't afford to live in the East End now, although she said some of the places were very scruffy. When I do the marathon, I've done about 40 Baruch Hashem so far in London. No, not in London, but whatever. I've done a lot in London. And I passed some of those houses. I mean, they are just palatial. They're just unbelievable, modern, state of the art. It's just unbelievable, Sylvia, because you said a lot of, Eleanor, I don't know why I'm calling you Sylvia, Eleanor, because you did mention, although we couldn't afford to live there, some of them are still, but I just see only beautiful buildings. I see new things springing up all the time. It's just unbelievable.
Yeah, so much so many new developments there. But a lot of the old Georgian houses, particularly around Cable Street and Spitalfield, have they're very fashionable. and they're being restored. It takes a lot of money to restore.
Yeah.
And they're worth like up to 20 million. So beautifully restored.
20 million?
Yeah. Some of them are worth up to, there's a beautiful double-fronted Queen Anne house in Fournier Street. Fournier is being French after the Huguenots. And that's actually where Queen Victoria's wedding dress was made, in that house. But
really?
that's
you should write a book. You really ought to write a book. You know an awful lot of things that I've listened to quite a few lectures, and you have some of it. I really do think you should write it down.
Yeah, see, the trouble is I've got diverse knowledge, but I can never focus on one thing because I always go off at a tangent. You know, there's always other things that are interesting. So, like, you know, I've just mentioned about Queen Victoria's wedding dress in this particular house. And the reason I mention the house is because I've never been inside it. I would love to go inside. But it's been so beautifully restored. I've seen pictures of it. And, you know, that's, I don't know what that's worth, but that could be worth, you know, potentially up to 20 million. It's quite possible. It really is. Yeah.
Is it? Well, I remember my mum talking about a place called Hoxton Square.
Yeah.
You know, Hoxton Square. And
yeah,
it was,
I know Hoxton
I mean,
Square.
they all lived in not slums, but they lived in sort of.
There were slums. They were slums.
But you know, and I said something to my mum about Hoxton Square, and she's, "Oh my God, we would never go to Hoxton Square."
Yeah.
And today, it's you know, it's like multi-million.
It's a phenomena. Who can explain it? Hoxton, no. Shoreditch. But you couldn't make it up, really. I know I'm using cliches, but they were never Jewish areas. Hoxton Square was never a Jewish area.
No.
Yeah, it was the other side of Bethnal Green. So,
yeah, but
Irish immigrants lived there.
Yeah, I can see Cyril waving at us. Do you want to?
Yeah, I'll unmute him. Hold on. Cyril, your line is open if you want to.
Yes, please. Can you hear me?
We can hear you well, yes.
I know you're talking about Aldgate going up, but on the other side of Aldgate, you have Middlesex Street and the Lane. Yeah. And back in the early 50s, my first job was around the corner to Middlesex Street, and I used to go for lunch to Barnett's in the Lane, and you get a sandwich there for 2 and tuppence. But if you couldn't afford 2 and tuppence, you went across the road to Strongwater and you could buy a salt beef sandwich for 1 and 11p.
Wonderful, wonderful. And there were so many others, Mossy Marks, Ostwins, so many others, you know. But let me tell you something interesting about Barnett's now that you've mentioned it. I wish I'd have put a picture up. They had a royal warrant, a plaque, royal warrant above their front door, and that's because they were commissioned by the palace offices, by Queen Victoria, to provide kosher meals whenever she entertained her Jewish guests. Like, you know, like I mentioned, the Rothschilds, use them as an example. Whenever the Jewish guests were being entertained at any of the palaces, but particularly Windsor Castle, then Barnett's of the Lane of Middlesex Street would have the commission to take kosher meat, already cooked.
But can I mention that the cockle seller at the beginning of the Lane had a sign on his stall that said, "Under the best gin," and that was because on the first floor were the offices of the best gin, and
that was Golston Street. Yeah, and that was Tubby Isaacs, actually, the Jelly Deal man.
Yes,
and he sold cockles and winkles, which are not kosher, and he was Jewish.
Yeah, and it was under the best gin.
I know, because that was the wall behind him and the window that was behind him, a Jewish organisation. How ironic.
My friend's father and grandfather had the the stable yard where they hired out all the barrows that were used in the market, in the street. And there'd be a queue there at 4 o'clock in the morning to hire a barrow, take it for the day and bring it back at night time. So that was just behind Tubby Isaac's store.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, and that was there right up until the 1960s.
Yeah, well,
or even later, probably until the 1980s. But there are not. If we're talking about Petticoat Lane, I don't think there are many, if any, Jews left there.
No,
on the stores. It's mostly Bangladeshi. Yeah, the demographics have changed completely. You know.
And don't forget Blooms at the corner, Gardens corner. You know, it's all there.
So much nostalgia.
History.
Yeah, so much nostalgia.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm just looking in the chat columns. There's so many. There's quite a few people that knew Miss Gerson at the settlement in the East End. Mentioned her name, and Miriam Moses, and lovely chats. Very nice. Thank you all for listening.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Well, thank you once again. I just wanted to just quickly about next week, who we've got Shlomo Kramer, who I think he's gone now, but he spoke just before. Shlomo is a retired judge looking back over 22 years of dispensing justice. Shlomo has over 40 years experience in the world of law, first as a solicitor and then as a judge, and all-rounder with a background in the areas of interpersonal and organizational skills, analysis of complex and weighty material, team working, energetic to drive matters forward, and performance delivery as a judgment report writer. He is a seasoned operator in independent analysis and sound assessment with many years of working in the judiciary. Now, he doesn't look like a judge, but he's one of the most funniest people that I know. So please turn up next week because you'll enjoy it. It'll be totally different to this. So all I can say now is that we'll carry on for a little bit if anybody wants to. We're sending malt whiskey round if you're still going to be there. If not, thank you very much for coming, and hopefully see you next week.
Okay.